So for those who don't know, I'm Paul O'Brien, the Managing Director of calQrisk, and in fairness, a lot of the work that we're going to cover today, my colleague who is here in the background, Fiona Kylie, has contributed heavily to, particularly the research around the reporting requirements. So I think we probably haven't most of the participants in now, so I'll go ahead. Just, I suppose, a description. The audience is mixed, so some of you will already have some fairly significant reporting requirements, and some of you won't have been there at all, and some of you possibly may never be reached for a mandatory reporting requirement. But increasingly, it's not just the obligation to report that's become an issue. It is the what the stakeholders think about, what the customers, consumers, anybody who's interested in looking at any of your sustainability efforts are thinking about it. So what we're trying to do with this webinar is to explore that and explore a lot of the, I suppose, the issues around where we are with sustainability. Just to give you a little bit of background, we are calQrisk. We're experienced in risk, compliance, and we have a software tool that is an award-winning governance, risk, and compliance software tool. What's unique about it is a complete A to Z system for managing governance, risk, and compliance. We are happy to welcome an awful lot of our customers here today. They come from all sorts of sectors, very mixed. Say risk, these are almost generic things. Risk, governance, risk, and compliance impacts effectively any or every business at some level. The agenda for today, the origin of ESG, we'll talk a little bit about that. So the emerging regulatory landscape, particularly on reporting, and then we're going to talk about doing, because before you report, you have to do. And I think a lot of people tend to, it's not that they miss that, they tend to focus on the report. The report is the outcome, but it's the outcome of activity. And that activity needs to be structured and planned. It needs to be real. It needs to be it needs to be comprehensive, and it needs to be set inside a framework. So we're going to look a little bit at the frameworks as well today, and hopefully you'll get something from it. It's a huge topic, and I suppose to some extent it's a scary topic, and in looking at it, we have tried to cover as much high-level information, and yet at the same time, huge desire to be as pragmatic as possible and give you something that might be useful. So this is the reporting history, if you like, and we're starting out in 1961, and probably the blue highlight issues here in terms of reporting are the major headlines, if you like. And I'm looking at, on the left-hand side, the 2004 ESG features in Who Cares Wins. That's really the beginning of the ESG term. And the UN, in that report, sort of set the floor level, or put in the foundations of what has become ESG. And then as you go through quite quickly, you can get an idea of some of the issues that emerged. And we've also made a note of things like in 2017, State Street, the vote against the re-election of directors at over 400 companies. And basically that's pointing at the social and governance piece rather than the climate change piece. So the ESG is bound together as a collective. Now we have, and we will in the recorded version of when we send out the slide deck, we'll include links to some of these. I suppose the second issue probably to point out is on the right-hand side, you're looking at what begins in 2022 and the activity that has gathered pace with the urgency of the issue around climate change. This pace is gathering. And I don't know how we managed to design the date for this event at the same time as the Dubai COP meeting, but you get a fair idea of what's going on and what will emanate from that, I would imagine, in a couple of weeks' time. But it gives you some idea, the reports from the COP meeting give you some idea of the complexity of the issues that they're dealing with, and effectively that we're all now dealing with. So just a summary, the first group with the UN, and that is that report, Who Cares Wins. And as I say, what's going on right now in the COP meeting is not insignificant, but the main issue is the ramping up of the call to action. Back in the beginning of the process, the UN effectively came up with 17 their Sustainable Development Goals. You'll be familiar with this. There are 17 of them, and the environment is addressed in 13, 7, 6, and 12. The social aspect is addressed in 3, 8, 10, and 5, and the governance issues are addressed in 11, 8, 17, and 9. But overall, the notion behind it was fairness, and I probably shouldn't use the term leveling up, but basically a global inclusion, a process that would make all of mankind and give all of mankind a fairer deal, if you like. And that was the notion behind it. And the binding together has been built into any of the agreements that they've arrived at the COP meetings, is that the developing countries want their share, and they want the spreading of the wealth. And I suppose one of the first and the highlights from the current meeting in Dubai was the agreement to fund the repair, if you like, of the damage for those countries that are likely to see the significant impact of climate change first. And while that fund is not a huge amount, apparently it is going to grow with some of the commitments that have been made at the side of the meeting. This gives you a graphic of the issues, the environmental. They talk about clean water and sanitation, clean energy, responsible production and consumption, and climate action. And the climate action one is the one that, for the most part today, we're going to talk about. On the social side, you have things like, and some of this has been driven through reporting as well. You have things like the transparency directive, pay transparency directive, for example, and pay transparency reporting, and that's getting down and down deeper into the smaller companies, so it spreads out and down, and that's happening literally, certainly in most of, I'm going to say, the Western world, developed world, that is happening, as is the drive towards good governance, and the governance part of it is about leadership, and it's about things like the State Street Action. It's about the leadership of organizations making decisions that are collectively and societal good. And in some cases, and I say this now because I'm going to go through it more, organizations that are made, sectors that are made up of many organizations, sometimes in these matters, the sector will lead. And the sector, in some cases, will have developed climate change roadmaps. The sector will have developed norms that they are expecting to see in both the social side and the governance side. So the sector roadmaps are very useful and a useful source of direction in the how-to when you get down to the basics of particularly the reporting. So moving to the reporting framework, the aims are here at the bottom. They're set out on behalf of the consumer. The reports make the organization's activity visible for customers, basically to make decisions. Consumers as stakeholders, as well as customers. In some cases, you might be looking at investment decisions, and that's the aim, is to make the activity visible. They're also looking at comparability. So across sectors and across organizations, the reporting equalizes a lot of the activity becomes visible, and the currency in which it is reported makes it comparable across sectors, across industries, and obviously across geographies. And one of the key issues, the aims of these reports, were to address greenwashing, because there was a strong sense, and particularly some consumer sentiment, that what was going into the reports was not true, basically, and it was being dressed in a way to deceive, perhaps to deceive, or certainly to make the organization look either good or, let me say, less bad as far as the activity was concerned, or their sustainability, their contribution to the ESG issues. Well, the scope of the reporting framework is, it's coming, the framework, these reporting frameworks are being gradually moved down, but there is a visible time frame and table to where they go to. And one of the things that we're often asked is, do I have to report? Well, some organizations don't have to report yet, but it's coming to them. And some organizations will wind up more or less having to report, not necessarily to a regulator, but to their upstream and downstream partners, dependencies, suppliers. They will be asked questions about how their sustainability performance is going. And that basically is in the scope of the climate action, the 1, 2, and 3 scopes, which we'll talk about in a minute. I'm conscious that this is sort of background, and I want to try and get into the point where we can start looking at some of the real stuff. We often use, you've seen this before, I'm sure many of you who have been on these webinars, the definition of risk in the ISO 31000 risk management standard, which is basically the effective uncertainty on objectives. And the issue here is whether the board or the leadership, I call them leadership because sometimes they don't have boards, they might have whatever the governing bodies might be, but the leadership, so the top end, the SMT, the board, the collective, has approved ESG and sustainability related objectives. So now every organization needs to have sustainability objectives in their strategy. And included in that, and we look at this as a risk context, so there's risk in climate action, there's risk in the carbon footprint goals. They talk about the setting the strategic goals. These are the highlights of the aspects of the sustainable goals, the UN goals. So we've broken them out here to give you an indication of the ones, the 3 we're focused on. So the social one is obvious as well. You need to have objectives. Sometimes it'll be an objective to achieve, sometimes it'll be an objective to maintain. And in those, you're then looking at how you monitor what you set to achieve, how you monitor the program of that achievement, or if you're in a maintain mode, so you believe that you've achieved whatever the requirement of the objective is, then you need to be able to monitor and confirm that your controls remain in place and remain effective. More of that later. Focus on the E. So the E is for environmental and Fiona particularly would insist and champion the social and the governance piece. So we'll get to those later. But for now, I'm going to focus on the climate action. So you're looking at the environment, the climate action piece, but particularly looking at carbon footprint goals, the goals of operational objectives. And one of those operational objectives will be operational resilience. A lot of you will have talked about operational resilience in the last 12 months. And obviously, the physical aspects of climate change on the business or on the customer base of the business, obviously address the operational resilience. And then the basic, sometimes forgotten, the reduce, reuse, and recycle aspects, the 4 Rs. The climate action, the why, I suppose the reality is that there are still deniers out there, and there's an extreme. So the extremes of opinion around climate action and the degree to which the human impact is the cause, and to some extent is agreed that it can be the cure, or at least slow it down. We've added some links, or we will include some links to some of the reports, I suppose, that deal with some of the sources of the kind of information that we're looking at. So those links will be in the handouts when we send them out. Some of the reports talk about the Earth science, which is the tilt of the Earth and the elliptic nature of the orbit of the Earth around the sun, and how that changes over the millennia. And the suggestion that is particularly by climate deniers, that is the cause, and that we're not really influencing it. So you get some of that, but the reality is that these are the facts, and probably the immediate one is the heat. So the ocean absorbing the heat. The ice melts, and the water effectively expanding in the ocean. And they're looking at up to 3 billion people affected in this before 22, so before the end of the century, basically. You're looking at up to 3 billion people affected if we cannot keep the temperature under 2 degrees increase. So just some background information, I suppose, on the why. So get into the reality of it. And some of you will already have done this. So you're looking at having an emissions baseline. Assess the full carbon footprint, understand the extent of the scope. You will have come across this scope 1, 2, and 3, and I'll go into that a little bit in a minute. And basically, that's an understanding. Then the issue is to understand what drives the emissions, or what you're trying to establish your baseline carbon footprint. Fully understand the operating environment. That's to deal with the regulatory and commercial environment. Sector norms, I mentioned this already, and sector norms and expectations have been established in many sectors, and they are important to look at because they inform, depending on the organization, they inform your actions, and they can inform your strategic planning. Some of them that I've looked at, for example, the aviation industry, they would say they're responsible for 2.9% of the emissions. And as a collective, you could say that people should stop flying, and there is a certain cohort out there that have begun flight shaming. And there's a sense that business travel could all move to Zoom meetings and all the rest of that. And that's out there. But the sector has put together through IATA a roadmap. And that sector roadmap goes out to 2050 and talks about the steps that technology will take over time to reduce the emissions and the footprint while keeping the aviation sector in business. And part of what we're looking at here is it's very easy to stop emissions, just go out of business. And what we're really trying to do is we're trying to look at how can we as business organizations continue to function and deliver what we deliver, while at the same time managing the reductions. So the sector norms are a good guideline. The regulatory and risk reporting environment is changing. Some of you will have arrived at it already, and we'll talk a little bit later on, but basically what you do this year is what's reported next year. So you see a date on these reports that you're obliged to submit, or you're driven to submit by your stakeholder cohort. What you're looking at here is today's action is what's reported tomorrow. So you need to be doing now in order to get enough detail, or in order to get your issues into the report of next year. So it's one of these things that you need to get about. One of the other things to understand is what peers and competitors are doing. As I said, this reporting is quite it's public, and for the most part it's public. And yeah, to be informed, take a look what others are doing. Somebody in your sector is doing it this way, then that's probably worth certainly learning from them. The next issue here in addressing it is to set emission reduction targets. And generally, you need to turn these into smart objectives. So they need to be sustainable. They need to be they need to be one of, I suppose, achievable is probably they need to be all of these things. They need to be time bound, particularly when you're reporting them. If you've got a timeline on it, if you've got an expectation on it, make sure that the objectives look that way. Have a transition plan and strategy, and you have to make a clear assessment of where you are today, and then you have to say, this is my future state. This is where I want to be. Then you need to put together projects and actions and we would advise always to use the plan, do, check, act cycle. And then repeat the cycle, repeat again, go again, go again. You'll find many, many tasks. In fact, in the initial transition plan and strategy, you've got to be careful not to overstate your resource, your capability to deliver them. So pick the ones that you are likely to deliver, and there'll always be some low-hanging fruit. There'll be some short-term, immediate, quick fixes that you can get onto, and then there'll be some longer ones, and there may be ones that have high levels of capital equipment associated with them. There may be funding required and all of that. But basically, if you have a strategy, the resources, then and a plan, get on with it. Measure and monitor and report the progress. That's very, very important, because that basically is that monitoring that will turn up in your reports. And I've added the word failures here because there are things out there that you might try and do. There are things that might be impossible. There's nothing wrong with reporting those, because what it is it's evidence of effort. And there's an honesty to it. I mean, you don't have to report a whole lot of the detail, but if things go wrong and if things don't work out as you anticipated, don't be afraid to say so. This refers back to the governance thing. Ensure that there's buy-in from the leadership and the stakeholders to the strategy. That's the alignment of the strategy. It has to have the buy-in, and it also has to have, in order to get the commitment of the entire organization and the stakeholder cohort, it has to have the buy-in of the leadership, and it has to have the visible buy-in of the leadership. They need to be committed. They need to protect the resources to make sure whatever they've committed to can be done, and they need to review the process regularly and be seen to do vigorous and enthusiastic reviews of how this is going. Some of the objectives, so I've stated these, and some of you might have seen this before. It's we will statements, transition the carbon footprint to net zero in a reasonable time frame, put a date on that, protect the physical aspects of the organization from extreme climatic change. So one of the things that people tend to forget when they're doing this, trying to go and cut the zero. But the first thing to do is you need to do a risk assessment of the physical assets of the business to see if they will survive the climate changes and the likely increased scenarios, higher flood levels, higher and more violent storms, and all of the associated things that go wrong to the physical assets. So that's an important thing to do. So in my head, I think defend. So you're looking at defending against climate change. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And sometimes that means making decisions. You may be looking at some assets and say, well, look, that has, no matter what I do, that asset's not going to survive for the next 20 years, given the degree of probable sea rise. And you can make some capital decisions on that. You may be closing, changing facilities. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And then the next one is and these are not exclusive and they're certainly not comprehensive. There'll be a whole lot more things that you will do here when you put down your climate action objectives, but you need to understand and respond to the regulatory, legislative, and sector impacts. And that's important to know what the regulators particularly are saying. And this is today is not that prescriptive, but it is rapidly becoming more prescriptive because the commitments that nations have made to the UN on climate change are slipping. So the 2030 commitments will get more severe as we approach 2030 if they're to be met at all. Now, there will be some backing away from some of them, and that's happened already in a number of places. But at the end of the day, this has to happen, and it will happen. So for some organizations, you may be looking at a complete redesign of the business model, and there will be organizations that will have to downsize. There will be organizations that will may well wind up going out of business, depending on the nature of what they do. And it's interesting to have the conversation going on in Dubai at the moment where there's a suggestion that all the oil fields be closed. And that's a sort of a fairly serious business model change for those guys. The next one I put in here was as an objective is to encourage connected stakeholders to share what they're doing to achieve net zero. So it's one of these things where it's a global problem and it's a common problem. Therefore, the solutions should be shared rather than kept. So they're not unique. They're not and shouldn't become a competitive advantage. Doing them should become a competitive advantage, but the fact of their success and should be shared. So we could do this. We did do this. It's worth doing. That should be shared among as many people as possible, many organizations as possible. And to be seen, visible and seen as a green stakeholder in your, a green champion in your stakeholder community, that's important as well. And it's important that, again, the avoidance of greenwashing, because there will be an awful lot of noise about green, but people who wear it, see it, use it and do it. Not everybody can, not every organization can, but where possible, be a visible green champion. We talked about scope, and this is sort of back to the, I suppose it's kind of the assessment of the emission. It's the beginning of the process, if you like. So the scope 1 emissions are direct emissions, and they're the ones that you have effectively control over, you own them. Phase 2 or scope 2 emissions are indirect, and they're created by the production of the energy that the organization buys. So, for example, this is just an example here that the inclusion of solar panels, the installation of solar panels, takes that away. So it brings it inside, and suddenly you're using electricity that's generated only from fossil fuels, and that would cut your scope 2 emissions. And then the big and hard one are the scope 3 emissions. These are also indirect. They're not produced by you on your behalf, but they differ from the scope 2 in that they basically extend in two directions, but they extend to the customers using the company product and the emissions that the suppliers to make your raw materials, to make the bits that go into the product, the company uses. There's a responsibility. You're attached to your proportion or your portion of those emissions as well, but the upstream and downstream, and that can be part of the scope and is therefore part of the reporting. This is a graphic that it's a good graphic. It kind of illustrates, run across the top are the gases that cause the climate change, the principal gases that cause climate change, and you look at your scope 1, which are the direct emissions. Up the middle, you have a high level of control over. The scope 2 are the purchased pieces, and then the scope 3, the upstream and the downstream. It's a good illustration of the kind of place that these emissions are coming from, and it's a good indication of the kind of place that in reporting, if you've got a supplier who is succeeding in reducing their emissions, their inclusion as a scope 3 emission reduction in the entirety of your activity is a valid piece to report, and the same in the downstream. And bear in mind, for product makers, you're looking at the end of life treatment of the sold goods. So all of that is part of the scope of the 3 scopes of the reporting requirement. So taking action. I was at a session recently, and it was a mix of a whole lot of people actually in the sports business, and they talked about what they were doing and what they were looking at, and these are just some of the observations that I picked up from. One was to think both carbon neutral and nature positive, because sometimes the nature aspect disappears, but in the carbon equation, the nature aspect and the nature positive aspect can be a contributor. So think both of those. And another observation was, it's better to do something small than talk about something big. And that is a kind of a call to action, that there's a lot of talk, or there can be a lot of talk about the enormity of the problem and all of that, but get on with it. Find something to do. There's plenty to do. I mean, if you go and brainstorm with your people, the probability is you'll come up with a list of things that you could do, no matter what business you're in. There are things that you could do in terms of that entirety of the scope, that you'll find positive actions that can contribute. One of the other things that is sometimes neglected, there's an awful lot of very, very good government programs on this space. There are tools, there are experts, there are people, they're there to help. And some people tend to overlook them, but find and use the support of those programs. Some of it's financial through grants, but an awful lot of it is expertise. It's wisdom and experience. And just asking the questions, go on the websites, well worth it. And I put in a note at the bottom to say that organizations should just do it. I've come across an awful lot, spoke to an awful lot of people who are doing it. They're going out and they're doing stuff. They're doing the risk assessments. They're looking at their structures. They're looking at their buildings. They're making repairs. They're doing stuff that will alleviate the issue, and they're also finding ways to reduce their carbon footprint. The obvious current one is the solar panels, and there's an awful lot of activity in that space at the moment. One of the people that was at that conference that in the sports space was the operator of a very, very significant indoor arena. And by putting solar panels on the roof of the arena, they wound up effectively with a huge payback. First of all, payback will happen quite quickly. And the reduction in their electricity bill allowed them to begin to put other projects in place that they hadn't considered before. So, for example, they completely redid the lighting. when they got it, and now they're exporting their electricity most of the time because the arena isn't in constant use. Most of the time they're exporting their electricity to the grid. So there are all sorts of good examples out there. What you're trying to do is reduce the carbon footprint to net zero and reporting the outcome, the actions taken. So really what that is do it and prove it. Prove you did it. So what you're doing is you're recording it. And I came back to the Plan, Do, Check, Act notion with the projects. Remember, there's a report piece to it. And the other thing is there's a strong sense that there's far more happening. There's far more being done than is actually being, I'd say reported, but it's actually being recorded. So what you need to do is be aware of that and make sure that where you're doing something, some record of it is maintained. Because at the end of the day, somebody will be looking to know how you're doing in this space. And you need to be able to give a true reflection of what you're doing, no matter what they say is you're obliged to report or how you're obliged to report. We generally look at the risks. So if you think of what the objectives were, the objectives basically are failure to achieve the objectives of the risk. So failure to make that transition. The physical assets of the organization I talked about earlier on, that's repeatable risk. So you just get check sheets and look at your scenarios and go and do your assessment. Probably do it with some kind of regularity in case things change. And you'll probably find there are things to do that you can do to remedy some of the visible and early ones. I'm looking at the bottom one here, and I'm talking about the reputation damage and the issue of inaction, protest, or greenwashing. In the reporting requirements where you're mandated to do the report, the greenwashing is one of the issues that can damage reputation. But the protest is something that we're seeing more and more of. And it's drawing attention to whatever the issue might be. There are some organizations that are being attacked by protesters. When I say attacked, they're extreme. You would have seen some of the sports that were interrupted recently by activists. And the reputation damage that's associated by the accusation of inaction can be significant in the sense of a wider audience. Stakeholders, your customer base, your membership, if you're depending on what business or space you're in, is influenced by protests. Why are these people protesting against my sector or my organization? And that reputation damage is really defended by your strong statement of the action you're taking. And that basically is back to the reporting again. So while we see the reporting perhaps as a burden on the one hand, where it's mandated, the reporting can be a very useful tool if properly used. So make sure you're sharing the good information and either alleviate or basically make the protest needs go away, or be in a position to defend if you are the subject of protest. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, requires you to report against a set of sustainability metrics. It originated with the ESRS, which is the European Sustainability Reporting, the financial reporting one. And the first draft of that was out, the first draft of the CSRD was out in April of 22. It is the final version of the ESRS was released and adopted by the EU on the 31st of July. and basically it establishes the sustainability standards. What I looked at here are just some of the things in that reporting. So avoid greenwashing. Agree at some point the level of detail you want to go into. Use hard numbers. When you're collecting data, generally deal with units, not cost, because the unit price moves. Audience focused. The audience isn't the regulator. The audience is your stakeholders, the wider stakeholder group, societal audience, and make sure whatever you put in the report is clear and understood. So does it make sense to you? Test it. Does it make sense to your staff? Does it make sense? Does it make sense? And that's where you're looking for the kind of things that might be attributed to greenwashing. Don't put fluff in it. If there's nothing to report or the success is limited, don't be afraid to say that. It's about an honesty. It's about, yeah, we tried this, we didn't work, we didn't have the money to do this, we'll do it in a year's time. Whatever it might be, don't be afraid to put your failures is probably a hard work, but the lack of success or where the success is limited, say it. On the practical stuff, and then we always try to, I suppose, give some kind of practical advice. Look for low-hanging fruit if you haven't already picked it all. And that's literally across the organization. Focus on the scopes, the 1, 2, and 3 scope. And bear in mind, in those scopes, you will be questioning your suppliers about what their situation is in terms of their carbon neutrality or in terms of their carbon footprint reduction. And you'll be looking at the downstream as well. So bear in mind, if you're asking your suppliers questions about their performance, your customers will be asking you the same questions. So that's why don't wait for somebody to tell you that you have to do a report. Have the information on a continuous basis. Do the risk assessments and the actions. And don't forget, the impact of the climate change is one of the parts of the risk framework that you do want to take, probably with some urgency, and you probably have that done already. And whatever actions are there, some of them will be long-term, some of them short-term, some of them intermediate, some of them will be done quickly. Your objective is carbon neutral. And do bear in mind that depending on your industry, there are ways to achieve carbon neutrality. Some of it is in the offsetting, particularly for the larger companies. Some of it is in the offsetting, but some of it also may be in the nature positive stuff. So do take a look at that. If you're struggling to get to zero and your circumstance can't do it, take a look at the nature positive aspects. Now, you can do that without a struggle. You can be carbon neutral and also nature positive. So there are some of the practical things to consider. That done with the environment, and I'm back to Fiona here, who would insist that the social piece is included in this because it is important. And just listed some of the stuff that's included in the S. So employee rights, all of these are, to some extent, legislated already. Probably the community engagement may not be, but that's something that it is worth looking at. I'm often asked the question, if somebody was to stand in front of your building, would they know you were a green champion? And that's part of the engagement in the community. Also, the thing I would look at is the human rights stuff, because when you look at your scope 3s, and you look up and down your supply chain or your product output, you're looking to see that there's no human rights breaches in it. It's worth asking the question. So look at the people you're dealing with, particularly if it's overseas, and just make sure that that there's no breaches. There's nothing suspect in anybody that you're dealing with. And obviously the end of it, compliance with all the legislative and regulatory requirements, and an awful lot of that is bound up in gender balance, diversity and inclusion. Those things important to check the boxes on and make sure you're there. And the governance one, the G, is basically continue to meet the requirements of the regulatory authorities, meet the equality and diversity goals. One of the biggest issues is probably the anti-bribery and corruption. And you've got all sorts of things like AML and the rest of it in there, and many of you will already be familiar with that. Ethical operation, and something that when the European the EFRS started, what they were looking at was the sustainable investing and some of the claims being made by some of the funds about what they were in. So you now have green funds that are attested, but anybody who is investing should consider as part of their governance regime the sustainability of what they're investing in. And the final one on this is to support a culture of sustainability through commitment and resource. Leadership, ownership, culture, resource, no point in talking about it if you're not willing to put your money or your people where your claims are, where your ambitions are. The leadership has to own it. If the leadership doesn't own it, and that is not just the governance piece, it's the E, the S and the G. If the leadership doesn't own it, you know it won't happen. I just put up some of the risk concerns here. And I suppose the one that I concentrate on here is the bottom one, fitting the ESG and the SDG programs into the organization's purpose. There are organizations who, when they sit down and look at the net zero and reaching the net zero and say they're organizations, there are probably sectors that may have to do a complete business model revision. So there are organizations that will basically have to go out of business because they're incapable of. Their business model is based on things that create the kind of gases that are basically impossible to get rid of if they want to stay in business. So that's why the sector experience is important to keep looking at that. And this is a built-in, not bolt-on, the ESG thing. The climate change now has to be a consideration for everything you do. And moving towards the net zero, the resource issue begins to become important. Investment and payback, and basically doing it, finding the things that will cause the reduction. That may mean changing, and there's an awful lot of organizations and product that will have already changed their packaging, how they deliver stuff. All of that is now part of this large consideration. I'm getting close to finished here, and apologies for probably taking maybe too long, but this is the marriage of two issues, the ESG factors and the operational resilience. It's just a chart. It's an interesting one to see where your programs that you have in the organization may overlap. So one begets the other. And this chart, it might be useful, but it gives you an idea of where those overlaps are. Again, takeaways. What are the takeaways from the session? One, actions this year will be in the report next year. Bear that in mind. So you need to be up and at it. And you need to just begin to think about what this will look like in a report. Again, go for the simple stuff fast if you're not doing it already. Consumers and other stakeholders will make decisions based on ESG and sustainability performance. So there are a cohort of people who will already be looking for what you're reporting and what you're doing. No matter the size of your organization, they're beginning to think that way. The sector get familiar with your sector's ESG and sustainability roadmap. The one, as I said earlier on, the one that comes to my head is the aviation sector. They know they are polluters. They know that everything they do contributes to ligacious emissions, but they have a plan, and they have articulated it, and they have laid it down with timelines. Anybody wants to have a look at it, take a look at the IATA roadmap. It's out to 2050, and there's a whole lot of stuff not happening early on. But it is a response to that flight shaming notion that their businesses may reduce as a result of people's awareness of the issues. But every sector should have a roadmap, a sustainability roadmap, as a guidance for its participants, for the cohort of companies that are within that sector, and have the sustainability conversation. It can be a very, very big conversation. It's at board level, at senior management level. See what the sector is saying, and then go into your own organization and have that sustainability conversation. What can we do? Can we stay in this business? Are there things that we would change? Decide on a plan. Have a plan. Obviously, it will be potentially changeable, but have a plan. So if somebody comes here and say, what's your sustainability plan? Be able to answer the question. Monitor the activity. And the monitoring is where your data for the reporting comes from. Monitor what you're doing. If it's a reduction in waste, if it's the use of this, if it's monitoring an upstream or downstream supplier or customer, then get an understanding of what your impact is, and you have to monitor. Ask the questions, ask them with some regularity, and include the outcome in your report. And report. When I say report, you may not be externalizing the report, but you should be able to put your finger on things like, for example, lending institutions. We do a lot of work with credit unions that are lending for green purposes, that kind of thing. Collect that kind of data. Any data that your business activity contributes to, even somebody else's sustainability agenda, is useful to gather. Thank you. I'm done. Questions? I should have mentioned at the outset that if anybody had any questions, to pop them in. We will share as usual, we will share the slide deck and some of the links to it. I look to Fiona to see, have we any questions?
No questions yet anyway, Paul.
Yeah, okay. There was a hand up there earlier on that I missed.
No, we don't have anybody with their hand up now.
No, okay. There's no questions in the chat room, so I'll make the assumption that if there are none, either everybody was happy or everybody went to sleep.
Oh, it's coming in now. So
just
yeah, so somebody's just saying, not a question, but a very informative presentation, thank you. And then somebody else is asking, what can you record in your software re-ESG? I guess that's calQrisk.
That's a calQrisk in the calQrisk software. So as far as the ESG is concerned, we've taken a look at the risks. So your physical risk assessment. But the other thing is a monitoring. So the monitoring module, there's an operations resilience module in it. And the other thing that's in it is there's a reporting tool. So the reporting tool, you can build reports with the reporting tool and pick the monitoring questions that are relevant to the ESG topic. There's operations resilience module in it. So yeah, lots. So whoever it is, if you're interested, send us an email and we'll give you a demo, show you it.
Yeah,
happily show you it.
Yeah, and I think maybe something else to mention is the third-party management.
Oh yes, obviously the third-party management, which basically is upstream. It's the upstream, so it's the left-hand side of the scope 3. There is a module in it that can ask a set of questions for you. Sometimes it's asked for due diligence for all sorts of compliance stuff, things like your supplier's view, cybersecurity, for example. That's part of it, and the ESG is an ESG question set that is developed for that as well. The monitoring in the upstream. The other thing you can do with it, there's an audit tool in it as well. So you can develop checklists if you've got something that you want to do on a continuous basis. It depends on the size of the organization, the nature of the organization, but basically, I won't say it's customizable. It is. The fundamental modules are in place, and you can use them to satisfy whatever your issue is, be it a compliance issue, a risk or compliance issue, or reporting issue. It can be modified, or I don't say modified, used to suit whatever pebble is in the shoe. And we do have certainly a fair bit of the ESG stuff covered in the various modules, but happy to do a demo whenever. Compliments. So lots of compliments and suggestions that people won't sleep ever again. There's a slide at the bottom of it that I didn't show, and it's probably one of the ones that, you know, when you go through this stuff, you just get, I won't say fearful, but if you allow that by the end of the century, and probably before that, they're actually talking about the title C rise. So, for example, the people that I met in the sports, there's one of them that would suggest, for example, that a large number of the golf courses on the seashore won't be there in 15 years. They won't be able to defend against the tidal sea rise and the salt water coming in on the grass. So that's the kind of thing you're looking at. A number of sports facilities that are close to rivers that are effectively currently unprotected probably won't be there. That kind of assessment is worth the doing. And people that are looking at it are saying, well, how are we going to do, or what are we going to do when we don't have that? But they're considering when we don't have, because they're beginning to think, yeah, we have to effectively move away from river courses and move away from the sea. And that's going to happen. Bangladesh is probably the big one. But in terms of the big risks, the things that, if you want to stay awake at night on this stuff, probably the thing that you can think about is what happens when you have, let's say, 300 million displaced people as a result of the increasing deserts in the equatorial deserts. The Sahara is increasing at a rate of 30 miles per decade for the last 4 decades, and it's going in 2 directions. And the people that are they're being moved for that, and they're beginning to move somewhere else. So you're likely to have conflict at borders. And when this starts to happen in volume, then yeah, we have to do everything we can to prevent it. So I'm convinced it is scary stuff. One of the things that we will do, we're committed to do, is we will send you links to a lot of the reports. So if you want to get deeper into the why, the report data will help you to reinforce that. If you're trying to convince somebody else or a board or somebody to do an action, then in there you will find something that will get people's attention and say, oh yeah, we have to do something with this. And some of them will be kind of, I want to say agenda driven, but like the Earthwatch stuff tends to be, I won't say extreme, but it tends to be, we know where they're coming from. So a lot of the organization, you know where they're coming from. The United Nations, the World Economic Forum, those kind of people, they tend to be far more balanced, or far more is probably the wrong word, better balanced in terms of, okay, are we sure that this is there? They are, those reports are, I suppose, less stark, but all still carrying the hope that this is fixable, I would add. Fiona, have we more questions or?
There was just one suggestion that it might be a good idea to go through examples of what scope 1, 2, and 3 actually are, because it is a tricky concept, but I don't think now is the time. I think we will take it away. We might do an article on it, or perhaps in lunchtime learning or something.
On the scopes, okay.
About the scopes, yeah.
Yeah. There are 2 very good websites of explanation, and I'll make sure that they're included. The links to those are included. But the scope 1 is everything that you do yourself. So your lights, your gas, your own footprint. That's scope 1. That's straight up. And the scope 2 is where you're buying in. So if you're buying in electricity, you can alter that by putting in the solar panels, and now suddenly the emissions that the ESB or whoever it is have been generating when they're running Money Point is a scope 2 emission. From your perspective, you put in solar panels and you become non-dependent on the ESB, then that is a scope 2 carbon reduction, from emissions reduction from your perspective. The scope 3s, the complex ones, but I'll certainly send you the links. And Fiona, to your suggestion, we might do a special on it. We do a lunch and learn on it, probably. Yeah. Okay.
Great. And there's still lots of people here, so thanks for your time. We've gone over.
There's a hand raised there, Fiona. Sorry.
Okay. I don't see that, Paul. Sorry. Can you tell me?
Missed it.
No, I don't see any hands raised. Okay. So I guess we'll finish up. We've held these people long enough. Lots of thanks coming in. And that was Ronan had his hand up, but he said it was accidental. So.
Oh, okay. That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Megan asked, "What's the best way to sign up to view those reports you mentioned?" We'll send them to you, Megan, as with the slides and link to the recording and the rest of the resources.
Yeah, the links to the sources is really what we're talking about. We'll go through them and clean them up and share them. And the other thing, if it's the reporting out of calQrisk, then certainly we can probably share some of those as well. Give you some examples of those. Yeah.
Okay, we'll leave it there.
Okay, listen, thank you very much for your patience, and I hope you got something from it, and you know where we are if we can be of any use or assistance to you. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Okay.